The video was only 42 seconds long, but it destroyed 26 years of carefully maintained illusion in less than a minute. My uncle didn't add commentary when he sent it to me at 11:30 on a Thursday night. He didn't need to. The footage spoke for itself. My mother standing in her kitchen with a glass of wine, laughing with her friends as she gestured toward her phone and said the words that would change everything. "Oh, Jessica? She's my personal cash machine. I just tell her I need something and she sends the money. It's perfect, really. She feels important, I get what I need, and everyone's happy." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The notification had interrupted what should have been a peaceful evening. I had been curled up on my apartment sofa in downtown Portland, reviewing client portfolios for the investment firm where I worked as a senior financial advisor. The message preview simply showed my uncle's name, Robert Mitchell, and the first line, "Jess, I think you need to see this." No context, no explanation, just an attached video file that would prove to be the catalyst for the most difficult transformation of my adult life. Before I continue with what happened next, I need to pause and ask you something directly. Have you ever discovered that someone you loved and trusted viewed you not as a person but as a resource to be exploited? Have you learned through accidental revelation that your generosity was being mocked rather than appreciated? Have you experienced the specific pain of realizing that what you believed was mutual care was actually a one-sided transaction where you were always the one giving? If any of this resonates with your own experience, then what follows is not just my story. It represents a pattern that appears across countless relationships where kindness is mistaken for weakness and family connection is weaponized for personal gain. Share your own experience in the comments if you feel comfortable doing so, because understanding we are not alone in these situations is often the first step toward reclaiming our dignity and rewriting the terms of engagement. My name is Jessica Chun, and for more than 2 decades I operated under a specific understanding about my relationship with my mother. I believed that Rachel Chun was a single parent who had sacrificed enormously to raise me after my father left when I was 3 years old. I understood that she had worked multiple jobs during my childhood, that money had been perpetually tight, that opportunities one received came at real cost to her comfort and security. This narrative had been presented consistently throughout my formative years, and had shaped my sense of obligation and my determination to succeed professionally, so that I could eventually ease her burdens. The story I had been told, and had internalized as foundational truth, was one of maternal sacrifice and daughterly duty. My mother had given up her dreams to ensure I had stability and opportunity. She had postponed her own education to work full-time when I was young. She had lived in modest circumstances so that I could attend decent schools and participate in enrichment activities. The implication, never stated directly but always present, was that I owed her not just gratitude but tangible reciprocation when I achieved the professional success her sacrifices had made possible. I had bought into this framework completely and willingly. There was no resentment about the obligation, no sense of burden about the responsibility I carried. I felt genuine appreciation for what she had provided and authentic desire to ensure her later years would be more comfortable than her earlier ones had been. When I landed my first professional position after completing my finance degree, my immediate thought was relief that I would finally be able to help her financially in meaningful ways. That assistance had begun modestly during my early career years when my own resources were limited. A few $100s here and there when she mentioned unexpected expenses or temporary cash flow problems. As my career advanced and my income grew substantially, the amounts and frequency of transfers increased proportionally. What had started as occasional help had evolved into regular monthly support, supplemented by additional contributions for specific needs as they arose. Over the past 5 years, since accepting my current position at Cascade Investment Partners, I had been sending my mother $2,000 monthly as baseline support. This amount covered her rent for the small townhouse she occupied in suburban Vancouver, Washington, just across the river from Portland. Beyond that regular transfer, there had been countless additional payments for various needs and wants. When her car required major repairs, I paid the $3,200 bill without hesitation. When she wanted to take a vacation to Hawaii with her friends, I contributed $1,500 toward the cost. When she mentioned her dental work was becoming expensive, I sent $2,000 to help cover the procedures her insurance did not fully pay for. I had never tracked these amounts systematically or maintained detailed records of what I provided. The giving felt natural, an expression of love and appreciation, rather than a financial transaction requiring documentation. My mother never explicitly asked for the money in ways that felt demanding or entitled. Instead, she would mention situations in conversation, describe challenges she was facing or opportunities she was considering, and I would offer to help because that was what good daughters did for mothers who had sacrificed for them. The relationship had felt balanced in my understanding of it. I provided financial support and she provided maternal connection, emotional encouragement, and pride in my accomplishments. We spoke several times weekly, shared meals together regularly, and maintained what I believed was a close and mutually caring relationship. Yes, the financial flow was primarily one-directional, but that seemed appropriate given our respective life stages and economic circumstances. I was building my career and accumulating wealth, while she was approaching retirement age with limited savings. Of course I should be supporting her. What I had not understood, what had been carefully hidden from my awareness, was that this entire framework existed only in my perception. The reality, as I was about to discover through 42 seconds of accidentally captured video, was entirely different. The evening the video arrived, I had been in an unusually good mood. I had just closed a significant new client account that would substantially boost my performance metrics for the quarter and position me well for the promotion to senior partner I had been working toward. The signing bonus alone from that advancement would exceed $80,000, and I had been mentally planning how I might use a portion of those funds to help my mother with the kitchen renovation she had been mentioning recently. My Uncle Robert was my mother's younger brother, someone I saw occasionally at family gatherings, but with whom I did not maintain regular independent contact. He lived in Seattle, worked as a software engineer for one of the major tech companies, and had always seemed pleasant but somewhat distant during our limited interactions. His message arriving unexpectedly late on a Thursday evening was unusual enough to capture my attention immediately. I opened the message and clicked on the video attachment without particular concern or anticipation of distress. Perhaps he was sharing something funny, or maybe there was family news he wanted to communicate visually rather than through text. The video began playing automatically, and within seconds I recognized my mother's kitchen, the distinctive backsplash and the arrangement of appliances immediately familiar from hundreds of visits. The camera angle suggested the phone had been propped on the counter, perhaps to record something else entirely, and had inadvertently captured the conversation happening in the background. My mother stood near the island with 3 women I recognized as her closest friends, neighborhood women she had known for years and socialized with regularly. They each held wine glasses and the relaxed posture and animated conversation suggested this was a typical evening gathering, the kind my mother hosted frequently. The audio quality was imperfect, with the women's voices occasionally obscured by background noise from what sounded like music playing elsewhere in the house. But the relevant portion of conversation came through with devastating clarity. One of the friends was apparently discussing her own daughter and some financial tension in that relationship. My mother's response was the part that would replay in my mind thousands of times over the coming weeks. "Oh, I don't have that problem with Jessica at all," my mother said, her tone light and somewhat amused. "She's my personal cash machine. I swear it's the easiest thing in the world. I just mention that I need something or want something, and within a day or two the money appears in my account. She never questions it, never asks for details, just sends whatever I tell her I need." One of the friends laughed and said something I could not quite make out. My mother continued, clearly enjoying the conversation and the attention from her audience. "The best part is that she thinks she's being this amazing daughter, fulfilling some sacred duty or whatever. She feels important, like she's taking care of me the way I took care of her. Meanwhile, I get what I need without having to actually work for it myself. Honestly, it's perfect. Everyone's happy." Another friend made a comment, and my mother nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. I mean, why should I struggle to pay for things when I raised a daughter who's making excellent money and feels obligated to share it? That's just smart parenting if you ask me. You invest in raising them right, and then you reap the returns when they become successful. Jessica is finally paying off, literally." The women all laughed together. the sound of their amusement filling the kitchen and creating a casual atmosphere that made the cruelty of the content even more jarring. This was not a moment of anger or frustration where harsh words were spoken in emotional distress. This was relaxed, comfortable mockery. My mother was entertaining her friends with stories about how effectively she manipulated her daughter, and everyone was enjoying the performance. The video continued for a few more seconds before cutting off abruptly, presumably when whoever was recording realized what had been captured and stopped the recording. I sat frozen on my sofa, my laptop still balanced on my knees, the video player showing the final frozen frame of my mother mid-laugh, wine glass raised, surrounded by friends who found her exploitation of her daughter to be amusing dinner party conversation. My first response was physical rather than emotional. My hands began shaking badly enough that I had to set the laptop aside to avoid dropping it. My heart rate accelerated dramatically, that sensation of pounding pulse visible in my peripheral vision. My breathing became shallow and rapid, triggering the lightheaded feeling that accompanies hyperventilation. I recognized these symptoms intellectually as a stress response, but that knowledge did nothing to mitigate their intensity. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. After the physical reaction came a wave of nausea so powerful I had to rush to the bathroom, convinced I was about to be sick. I knelt on the cold tile floor, gripping the porcelain toilet, waiting for my body to follow through on the threat. But nothing came except dry heaving and the sour taste of adrenaline in my mouth. I remained there for several minutes, forehead pressed against my arm, trying desperately to regulate my breathing and regain some measure of physical stability. When I finally felt capable of standing without collapsing, I returned to the living room and replayed the video. Perhaps I had misheard. Perhaps the context was different from what I thought. Perhaps there was some explanation that would make this less devastating than it appeared. But watching it a second time only confirmed what I had heard initially. The words were clear. The tone was unmistakable. The meaning was exactly what it seemed to be. I played it a third time, and then a fourth, as though repetition might somehow change the content or reveal hidden nuance that would soften the blow. But each viewing only reinforced the same terrible truth. My mother viewed me as a cash machine. She found my sense of filial obligation amusing. She enjoyed manipulating me and felt clever about having established a system where I willingly provided financial support, while believing I was honoring family bonds. The entire relationship I thought we shared was, from her perspective, a successful long-term extraction strategy. My phone sat on the coffee table, screen dark, containing the video that had detonated in the center of my carefully constructed understanding of family and identity. I picked it up and looked at the message thread with my uncle. Above the video were just those few words. "Jess, I think you need to see this." I scrolled up through our previous message history, which was sparse and limited to occasional holiday greetings and logistical coordination for family events. I typed a response, deleted it, typed another, deleted that as well. What was there to say? "Thank you for destroying my illusions. I appreciate you showing me that my mother views me as an ATM." After several false starts, I finally sent a simple message. "When was this recorded?" His response came within minutes, suggesting he had been waiting to see if I would reply. "Last weekend. I was at her place to drop off some furniture she wanted. I set my phone up to record a tutorial for the assembly, and this got captured accidentally. I debated whether to send it to you, but I figured you deserved to know how she really talks about you when you're not around. I'm sorry, Jess. I know this must be really hard. Last weekend. 6 days ago." Which meant this conversation had occurred shortly after I had sent her an additional $1,500 to help cover what she had described as unexpected medical expenses not fully covered by her insurance. I had transferred that money immediately upon receiving her text about the supposed bills, not even asking for documentation or details because I trusted her implicitly and wanted to relieve whatever stress she was experiencing. She had taken that money I had sent out of genuine concern for her well-being, and within days was entertaining her friends with stories about what an easy mark I was. The timeline made it so much worse somehow. This was not ancient history or a single moment of poor judgment. This was her current active perception of our relationship and of me. I navigated to my banking app and pulled up my transaction history with my mother. The regular monthly transfers of $2,000 appeared like clockwork on the first of each month, dating back more than 5 years. Interspersed among those scheduled payments were dozens of additional transfers in varying amounts. $3,000 in March for her car repairs. $800 in April for new furniture she wanted. $1,200 in May for the Hawaii vacation contribution. $2,000 in June for home repairs. $1,500 just last week for the supposed medical expenses. I scrolled back through months and then years of transfers, watching the amounts add up with nauseating speed. Over the past 12 months alone, I had sent her $37,400. Over the past 5 years, the total exceeded $160,000. That figure did not include purchases I had made directly on her behalf, gifts I had bought for her, meals I had paid for when we dined out together, or any of the countless other ways I had subsidized her lifestyle. $160,000. More than 3 years of my undergraduate tuition. Enough for a substantial down payment on a house. Enough to fully fund retirement accounts for multiple years. Enough to represent genuine financial security that I had instead transferred to someone who viewed me as a cash machine and laughed about it with her friends over wine. The analytical part of my mind, the part trained through years of financial advising to assess situations objectively and identify patterns in data, began automatically processing this information. The amounts had escalated over time in direct correlation with my income increases. When I had earned less, her needs had been smaller. As I earned more, suddenly she needed more. The requests always came with stories designed to generate emotional response. Health scares, emergency situations, opportunities she could not quite afford on her own. I opened my computer and created a spreadsheet because that was what I did when confronting complex financial situations. I began entering every transfer I could document, along with the justification she had provided for each one. As the list grew, patterns emerged that should have been obvious but had been invisible when I was experiencing them sequentially rather than viewing them collectively. The supposed emergencies were suspiciously regular, arriving like clockwork whenever my bank account balance grew beyond a certain threshold. The medical expenses she claimed were rarely accompanied by any documentation, and on the few occasions I had asked to see bills to ensure I was sending the right amount, she had become hurt and offended that I did not simply trust her. The vacation contributions and entertainment expenses were framed as rare treats she deserved after years of sacrifice, but they occurred multiple times annually. Most tellingly, her expressions of gratitude had been carefully calibrated to reinforce my behavior without ever actually acknowledging the scale of what I was providing. She thanked me for being thoughtful, for being generous, for being a good daughter. But she never acknowledged the actual amounts involved, or the cumulative impact on my own financial position. She kept the focus on the emotional dimension of my giving rather than the economic reality of her taking. I had been systematically manipulated for years, and I had never seen it because I was looking at the relationship through the lens of the narrative I had been taught. Good daughters help their mothers. Family takes care of family. She sacrificed for me, so I owed her support in return. These principles were not inherently wrong, but they had been weaponized to create a dynamic where I gave endlessly, and she took strategically while framing my compliance as virtue rather than exploitation. The worst part, the element that hurt most acutely as I sat surrounded by financial records documenting my own systematic exploitation, was not even the money itself. It was the mockery. She did not just take my resources. She laughed about how easy it was. She entertained her friends with stories about my gullibility. She felt clever and successful for having raised a daughter who could be manipulated so effectively. I was not just a source of income to her. I was a joke, a punchline, evidence of her superior strategic thinking. I closed my laptop and sat in the darkness of my apartment, listening to the ambient sounds of the city outside my windows. Traffic noise drifted up from the street below. The building's heating system clicked and hummed. Somewhere above me, a neighbor's footsteps crossed their floor. Normal life continued around me, completely indifferent to the personal catastrophe I was experiencing. The clock on my wall showed nearly 2 in the morning. I had been sitting in shock for more than 2 hours, cycling through the same realization repeatedly as though repetition might eventually make it feel less devastating. But each cycle through the evidence only confirmed what I already knew. My mother did not love me the way I loved her. Our relationship was not what I believed it to be. The foundation of my adult identity, built on the story of being a good daughter repaying maternal sacrifice, was constructed on false premises. My phone buzzed with an incoming text message. For a moment of irrational hope, I thought perhaps it was from my mother, that somehow she knew I had seen the video and wanted to explain or apologize. But it was from my best friend, Alicia Morrison, sending a late-night message about weekend plans. The normalcy of the communication, the assumption that my life was continuing along its usual trajectory, felt jarring given the internal devastation I was experiencing. I did not reply to Alicia. I could not imagine trying to explain this situation to anyone, could not find words that would convey the specific pain of discovering you have been a fool in the eyes of someone you loved and trusted. How do you tell people that your mother views you as an ATM and finds it funny? How do you admit that you have been sending enormous amounts of money to someone who mocks your generosity behind your back? Sleep was clearly impossible. My mind was racing too frantically, cycling through memories and reinterpreting them through this new lens of understanding. Moments I had treasured as evidence of our close relationship now appeared in a different light. Her effusive praise for my career success was really assessment of my increased earning capacity. Her interest in my work projects was really monitoring my financial trajectory. Her encouragement of my advancement was really investment in her future returns. Even positive memories became contaminated. The pride in her voice when she told her friends about my promotion was not maternal love but satisfaction that her strategy was paying off. The gratitude she expressed when I helped her financially was not authentic appreciation, but performance designed to ensure continued compliance. Everything was suspect now. Every interaction had to be reconsidered. Every memory had to be re-examined. As dawn began to break over Portland, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed inappropriately beautiful given the darkness of my thoughts, I made a decision. I was not going to confront my mother immediately. I was not going to make any dramatic gestures or send angry messages in the heat of initial emotional response. Instead, I was going to approach this the way I approach complex problems professionally, with systematic analysis, strategic planning, and careful execution based on complete information rather than reactive emotion. I needed to understand the full scope of what had been happening. I needed to document everything comprehensively. I needed to consult with people who could provide objective perspective. I needed to determine what I actually wanted from any confrontation or boundary setting, what outcome would represent genuine resolution, rather than just venting hurt feelings. I needed to be methodical and deliberate rather than impulsive and emotional. This decision brought a measure of calm that had been absent throughout the night. I had a framework now, a plan of action that gave me something to focus on beyond the circular processing of betrayal and hurt. I opened my laptop again and created a new folder labeled Simply Documentation. Into this folder I moved the video my uncle had sent, the spreadsheet I had created of financial transfers, and screenshots of relevant text message conversations with my mother. Over the coming days, I would expand this documentation systematically. I would compile every piece of evidence that illustrated the pattern of our relationship. I would organize the information in ways that would make the dynamics clear to anyone reviewing it. I would build a comprehensive case not for any legal proceeding but for my own clarity, and for any future conversations that might be necessary. But first, I needed to deal with the immediate practical question that suddenly felt urgent. My next scheduled transfer to my mother was set to process in 4 days, the regular first-of-the-month payment that had been occurring automatically for years. That transfer needed to be stopped. I logged into my banking platform and canceled the recurring payment. The action felt simultaneously insignificant and monumental. A small technical change that represented a massive shift in the fundamental structure of our relationship. With that task completed, I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of exhaustion that had been building throughout the sleepless night. I moved to my bedroom, closed the blinds against the morning sunlight, and collapsed into bed fully clothed. Sleep came quickly despite my earlier conviction that it would be impossible, my body overriding my racing mind and demanding the rest it desperately needed. My dreams were fragmented and disturbing, populated by distorted versions of familiar people and situations. My mother appeared repeatedly, but her face kept shifting, sometimes familiar and loving, sometimes cold and mocking. I was trying to give her something in these dreams, but whatever I offered would transform into something worthless or ridiculous when she touched it, and she would laugh while I stood there feeling foolish and small. I woke in early afternoon feeling physically terrible, my head pounding and my body aching as though I had the flu. The emotional trauma had manifested in physical symptoms that made normal functioning difficult. I forced myself to shower and eat something, going through the motions of basic self-care while my mind remained partially elsewhere, still processing the revelations of the previous night. My phone showed multiple missed calls and several text messages. 2 were from my mother, brief and cheerful notes about nothing in particular, the kind of casual check-in messages she sent regularly. Reading them now, knowing what I knew about her actual perception of me, made my stomach turn. The false warmth in her words, the performance of maternal affection that was really just relationship maintenance to ensure continued financial access. I did not respond to her messages. I was not ready to engage while everything still felt so raw. Instead, I focused on the other missed communications. There was a voicemail from my Uncle Robert, his voice gentle and concerned, saying he hoped I was okay, and that he was available if I wanted to talk. There was a text from Alicia asking if everything was alright since I had not responded to her previous message, which was unlike me. I sent a brief reply to Alicia saying I was dealing with some family stuff and would catch up with her soon. To my uncle, I sent a text thanking him for the video, and letting him know I needed some time to process but appreciated him making me aware of the situation. Both responses were deliberately vague, buying me space and time before I had to articulate what was happening to anyone else. The remainder of the weekend passed in a blur of documentation work and emotional processing. I compiled years of financial records. I reviewed text message conversations looking for patterns I had previously missed. I made notes about specific incidents that took on new meaning in light of what I now understood about my mother's actual motivations and perceptions. By Monday morning, when I needed to return to work and resume normal professional functioning, I had created a comprehensive file that told an undeniable story of systematic manipulation and exploitation. The evidence was clear and extensive. What remained unclear was what I was going to do with that evidence and how I was going to move forward from this point of devastating recognition. The following Monday arrived with the relentless momentum of professional obligations that cared nothing for personal crisis. Jessica woke before her alarm, her body still operating on the disrupted sleep schedule that had characterized the past several days. The weekend had been consumed entirely by documentation and analysis, transforming her apartment into a makeshift investigation center, where every surface held evidence of her mother's systematic exploitation. Now she needed to compartmentalize that reality sufficiently to function in her professional role, to attend meetings and advise clients and maintain the polished competence that her position demanded. The morning routine provided structure that helped ground her in normalcy. Shower, coffee, the careful assembly of professional appearance that signaled capability and control. She selected a charcoal gray suit that projected authority, paired it with minimal jewelry, and applied makeup with precision that concealed the physical evidence of sleepless nights and emotional turmoil. The woman who looked back from the bathroom mirror appeared completely put together, betraying nothing of the internal devastation she was managing. The commute to Cascade Investment Partners' downtown Portland offices took 25 minutes through typical Monday morning traffic. Jessica used the time to mentally prepare for the performance she would need to deliver throughout the day. Her calendar showed back-to-back client meetings, a team strategy session, and individual check-ins with 2 junior advisors she was mentoring. None of these professional obligations could be postponed or handled with anything less than full attention and expertise. She arrived at the office by 7:30, earlier than most of her colleagues but consistent with her usual pattern of using early morning hours for focused work before the day's interruptions began. Her office occupied a corner position on the 14th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of the Willamette River and the bridges spanning its width. The space was tastefully furnished with modern pieces that balanced professionalism with personality, decorated with artwork from local artists and credentials from her various professional certifications. Jessica set her briefcase beside her desk and powered on her computer, watching the dual monitors illuminate with the familiar dashboard of market data, client portfolios, and internal communications. Everything appeared exactly as it had on Friday afternoon when she had left for what should have been a normal weekend. But she was fundamentally different now, changed in ways that were invisible to external observation but absolute in internal experience. Her email inbox contained the usual Monday morning volume of messages requiring attention. Client inquiries, internal updates, industry newsletters, meeting confirmations. She began processing them methodically, responding to urgent items and categorizing others for later attention. The familiar rhythm of professional communication provided a welcome distraction from the thoughts that kept intruding whenever her focus wavered. Halfway through the inbox review, a message from her mother appeared. The timestamp showed it had been sent just 20 minutes earlier, suggesting Rachel was awake unusually early for someone who typically slept late into the morning. The subject line read simply "checking in," and the preview text showed the opening line asking if Jessica was feeling all right since she had not responded to weekend messages. Jessica stared at the email preview without opening it, her cursor hovering over the unread message while she debated how to handle this first direct contact since seeing the video. The natural impulse was to respond immediately with cheerful reassurance, to maintain the pattern of immediate availability and responsiveness that had characterized their communication for years. But that impulse came from the version of herself who had not yet seen behind the curtain, who had not yet understood how her responsiveness was perceived and exploited. She marked the email as unread without opening it, and returned to processing other messages. The decision felt simultaneously petty and necessary, a small assertion of control in a situation where she had been controlled for so long without realizing it. Her mother could wait for a response. The immediate attention Jessica had always provided was not actually mandatory, regardless of how the relationship dynamics had trained her to believe otherwise. The morning's first client meeting began at 9 o'clock, a quarterly portfolio review with a couple approaching retirement who had been her clients for 3 years. Jessica entered the conference room with her materials perfectly prepared and her professional demeanor firmly in place. For the next 90 minutes, she discussed asset allocation strategies, risk management approaches, and projected income streams with the expertise and attentiveness that had built her reputation. The clients left satisfied and reassured, completely unaware that their advisor was simultaneously managing a personal crisis of significant magnitude. Between meetings, Jessica checked her personal phone and found additional messages from her mother. 2 texts had arrived during the client meeting, each progressively more concerned about Jessica's uncharacteristic silence. The first asked again if everything was okay, and mentioned that Jessica usually responded more quickly. The second noted that the monthly transfer had not appeared in Rachel's account as expected, and asked if there was some technical problem with the bank that needed to be addressed. The progression was revealing. Initial concern presented as maternal care, quickly transitioning to focus on the missing money. The pattern was exactly what Jessica would have expected based on her new understanding of their relationship dynamics, but seeing it play out in real time still produced a physical response. Her heart rate increased and her hands tightened around the phone as she read the messages that so perfectly illustrated what she had been to her mother all along. She did not respond to these messages either. Instead, she opened her contacts and scrolled to a name she had not called in several months. Dr. Sarah Brennan was a therapist who specialized in family systems and trauma, someone Jessica had seen briefly 2 years earlier during a period of work-related stress. The therapeutic relationship had been positive, and the door had been left open for future contact if needed. This situation definitely qualified as needing professional support. Jessica left a voicemail with Dr. Brennan's service requesting an appointment as soon as possible and indicating that she was dealing with an urgent family matter that required immediate attention. The act of reaching out for help felt like a significant step, an acknowledgement that she could not, and should not try to navigate this situation entirely alone. Professional guidance would be essential for processing the emotional dimensions of what she was experiencing, and for determining healthy responses to her mother's inevitable escalation. The remainder of Monday passed in a blur of professional obligations executed with mechanical competence, while Jessica's mind remained partially occupied with the personal crisis running parallel to her work responsibilities. She attended meetings, analyzed financial data, advised clients, and maintained the appearance of normal functioning. But underneath that professional performance, she was constantly aware of the growing number of unanswered messages from her mother, and the approaching moment when silence would no longer be sustainable. By late afternoon, her mother's communications had escalated from concern to confusion to irritation. A voicemail left at 3 o'clock carried a sharp edge that had been absent from earlier messages. Rachel's voice conveyed annoyance poorly disguised as worry as she pointed out that Jessica had never before gone an entire day without responding and demanded to know what was going on. The entitlement in her tone was striking, the assumption that Jessica owed her immediate attention and explanation. Jessica listened to the voicemail twice, analyzing the emotional content and the underlying expectations it revealed. Her mother was not actually worried about her well-being. She was worried about the disruption to established patterns, concerned that something had changed in the dynamic she had been successfully exploiting. The missing money transfer had clearly triggered alarm, and Jessica's unresponsiveness had amplified that concern into something approaching panic. This observation provided useful information about how her mother perceived their relationship and what she actually valued within it. The financial dimension was primary, the emotional connection secondary at best. When the money stopped flowing, the performance of maternal affection intensified in service of restoring the previous arrangement. It was transactional in the most literal sense, and watching it unfold with her new awareness made the manipulation starkly visible. Tuesday morning brought a response from Dr. Brennan's office confirming an appointment for Thursday afternoon. The 2-day wait felt simultaneously too long and potentially necessary for gathering her thoughts sufficiently to make productive use of the therapy session. Jessica accepted the appointment time and added it to her calendar, blocking the full hour and the time surrounding it to ensure she would not be rushed or distracted. Her mother's messages on Tuesday shifted tone again, moving from irritation to hurt feelings. A text arrived mid-morning expressing how sad Rachel felt that Jessica was apparently upset with her about something but refusing to communicate about it. The message emphasized how much Rachel valued their close relationship and how important open communication had always been between them. It was a masterful piece of emotional manipulation, framing Jessica's silence as a character flaw while positioning Rachel as the reasonable party seeking resolution. Jessica recognized the tactic for what it was, but that recognition did not eliminate the emotional response it triggered. Years of conditioning had trained her to feel guilty when her mother expressed hurt or disappointment. The impulse to apologize and explain, to soothe her mother's feelings and restore harmony, remained powerful despite her intellectual understanding that the entire framework was designed to maintain her compliance. Resisting that impulse required conscious effort and produced significant internal discomfort. She drafted several responses throughout the day, typing and deleting messages that ranged from lengthy explanations to brief deflections. None of them felt right. Explaining would require revealing that she had seen the video, which would inevitably trigger a defensive reaction and potentially destroy the evidence if her mother warned others to delete similar recordings. But continuing to ignore the messages indefinitely was not sustainable either, particularly given that they shared an extended family and social network where her mother could easily create narratives about Jessica's supposedly inexplicable behavior. By Wednesday afternoon, Jessica had still not responded to any of her mother's communications despite receiving more than a dozen messages across text, email, and voicemail. The silence had extended for nearly a week since the video had arrived, and the tension of maintaining that silence while managing her own emotional processing had become exhausting. She felt constantly on edge, hypervigilant about her phone notifications, and anxious about the inevitable confrontation that would need to occur. Her uncle Robert called Wednesday evening as she was preparing dinner in her apartment. She answered immediately, grateful for contact with someone who understood at least partially what she was experiencing, and who had demonstrated care for her well-being by sending the video in the first place. Robert's voice carried genuine concern as he asked how she was managing. Jessica found herself suddenly emotional in a way she had not allowed herself to be since Friday night. Something about speaking with someone who knew the truth and cared about her response to it opened a release valve on the pressure she had been maintaining. She told him about the documentation she had compiled, the money she had stopped sending, the messages she had been ignoring, and the therapy appointment she had scheduled. He listened without interruption until she finished, then spoke with careful thoughtfulness. He acknowledged that what she was dealing with was genuinely difficult, and that there were no simple or painless solutions. He shared that he had observed concerning patterns in his sister's behavior for years, but had not felt it was his place to interfere in her relationship with her daughter. Seeing the video accidentally and recognizing how she was talking about Jessica had compelled him to act despite his usual policy of non-interference in family dynamics. Robert asked what Jessica thought she wanted to achieve through any eventual confrontation or boundary setting. The question was more complex than it initially appeared. Did she want to repair the relationship on different terms? Did she want accountability and apology? Did she want complete separation? Did she want her mother to understand the impact of her behavior, or had she already accepted that such understanding might be impossible? Each potential goal would require different approaches and would produce different outcomes. Jessica admitted she did not yet know what she wanted beyond the immediate need to stop being exploited, and to establish that she would not continue functioning as a cash machine. Everything beyond that remained unclear. She felt angry and hurt and betrayed, but she also felt grief for the loss of the relationship she had believed existed. She wanted her mother to somehow become the person Jessica had thought she was, while simultaneously recognizing that person had never existed outside of her own wishful perception. Her uncle offered a perspective that was both compassionate and pragmatic. He noted that people rarely changed fundamental character patterns, particularly when those patterns had been serving them successfully for extended periods. Rachel had been operating this way for years, possibly decades, and the arrangement had been working perfectly from her perspective. The likelihood that she would suddenly develop insight, remorse, and motivation to change was realistically quite low. Jessica needed to prepare for the probability that confrontation would not produce the acknowledgement or transformation she might hope for. This observation was difficult to hear but aligned with what Jessica had been observing in her mother's escalating messages. Rachel was not questioning her own behavior or wondering if she had done something to damage the relationship. She was focused entirely on restoring the previous dynamic and getting Jessica back to her established pattern of compliance and financial provision. The self-reflection and accountability that would be necessary for genuine relationship repair were entirely absent. They talked for nearly an hour, with Robert sharing some of his own experiences navigating relationship with Rachel over the years, and the boundaries he had learned to maintain to protect himself from similar exploitation. He had never been as valuable a target as Jessica, because his relationship with his sister was sibling rather than parental, lacking the guilt leverage that came with narratives about maternal sacrifice. But he had still experienced various attempts at manipulation, and had developed strategies for maintaining connection, while protecting his resources and autonomy. The conversation concluded with Robert offering his continued support, regardless of what decisions Jessica made going forward. He emphasized that she should not feel pressure to maintain family relationships that were fundamentally unhealthy simply because cultural narratives about family loyalty suggested she had obligations that superseded her own well-being. Sometimes the most loving thing people could do for themselves was to create distance from those who could not or would not treat them with genuine care and respect. After ending the call, Jessica felt simultaneously more supported and more aware of how difficult the path forward would be. Having her uncle's validation and perspective helped counter the internal voices insisting she was overreacting or being ungrateful. But his realistic assessment of her mother's likely response to confrontation also eliminated some of the hopeful scenarios she had been entertaining about potential reconciliation and relationship transformation. Thursday arrived with the therapy appointment scheduled for late afternoon. Jessica took a half-day off from work, citing personal matters that required attention. Her colleagues accepted this without question, as she rarely requested time off and had accumulated substantial leave balances through her tendency to prioritize work over personal time. She spent the morning at home organizing her thoughts and reviewing the documentation she planned to share with Dr. Brennan. The therapy office was located in a renovated historic building in Northwest Portland, a quiet professional space designed to feel calming and private. Jessica arrived 15 minutes early and used the time to complete intake paperwork and settle her nerves. When Dr. Brennan emerged from her office to greet her, the familiar presence of someone who had helped her navigate previous difficulties provided immediate reassurance that she was in the right place seeking appropriate support. The session began with Dr. Brennan inviting Jessica to share what had brought her back to therapy after 2 years. Jessica provided an overview of the situation, showing the therapist the video on her phone and walking through the financial documentation she had compiled. Dr. Brennan watched and listened with the focused attention that characterized her clinical approach, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly allowing Jessica to tell the story in her own way and at her own pace. When Jessica finished the initial account, Dr. Brennan sat quietly for a moment before responding. Her assessment was direct and clinical, identifying the pattern as financial exploitation embedded within a relationship structured around narcissistic dynamics and parentification. She explained that what Jessica had experienced was a form of emotional abuse where normal parent-child relationship boundaries had been inverted, with the child being made responsible for the parent's well-being and emotional needs from an inappropriately young age. The therapist noted that the narrative Jessica had been taught about her mother's sacrifices was likely a distorted version of normal parental responsibility that had been reframed to create obligation and guilt. Single parents certainly faced genuine challenges and made real sacrifices, but presenting those challenges as debts the child owed, rather than as the basic function of choosing to be a parent, was a manipulation tactic designed to ensure long-term control and access to resources. Dr. Brennan explained that children raised in such dynamics often developed heightened sensitivity to parental needs and emotions, becoming expert at reading moods and managing relationships to maintain stability. They learned that their value was tied to their usefulness, that love was conditional on meeting expectations, and that their own needs and feelings were secondary to maintaining family harmony. These patterns typically persisted well into adulthood, unless consciously recognized and actively addressed through therapeutic work and boundary establishment. Jessica recognized herself completely in this description. She had always been attuned to her mother's emotional states, always ready to help solve problems or provide support, always feeling responsible for her mother's happiness and well-being. The idea that this was not normal healthy relationship functioning, but rather a distorted dynamic that had been deliberately cultivated for exploitative purposes, was both validating and deeply disturbing. The therapist asked Jessica to articulate what she believed she deserved from family relationships, and what healthy mother-daughter dynamics should ideally include. The question was surprisingly difficult to answer. Jessica had spent so many years operating within the framework she had been taught that imagining alternative structures felt almost impossible. What would a relationship look like where she was valued for her inherent worth rather than her utility? Where support flowed in both directions rather than being unidirectional extraction? Where her success was celebrated without being immediately converted into expectations for her to share the material benefits? Dr. Brennan helped her begin to construct a vision of what healthy relationship might look like, identifying key elements like mutual respect, appropriate boundaries, emotional reciprocity, and support that enhanced autonomy rather than creating dependence. She emphasized that Jessica had every right to expect these elements in her relationships, and that their absence was not a reflection of her inadequacy, but rather of the other person's unwillingness or inability to engage in healthy relational patterns. The session moved into practical discussion about how Jessica might respond to her mother's messages, and what boundaries she needed to establish going forward. Dr. Brennan suggested that Jessica needed to first clarify for herself what outcome she was seeking. Did she want to attempt relationship repair with new boundaries in place? Did she want a period of separation to process her feelings and determine what level of contact felt sustainable? Did she want permanent distance? Each option was valid, and the choice needed to be based on Jessica's own assessment of what would support her well-being, rather than on external expectations about family obligations. Jessica admitted she was still uncertain about what she wanted long-term, but knew that she could not continue in the previous pattern. At minimum, she needed her mother to acknowledge what had happened, to take accountability for the exploitation and manipulation, and to demonstrate genuine remorse and commitment to change. Without those elements, any attempt at continuing the relationship would simply perpetuate the existing dysfunction. The therapist gently noted that Jessica might need to prepare for the possibility that her mother would not be capable of providing the accountability and change she was hoping for. Many people who engaged in these patterns lacked the self-awareness or emotional capacity to recognize their own behavior as problematic. They genuinely believed they were entitled to whatever they had been taking, and confrontation typically produced defensive reactions rather than insight or remorse. Jessica's mother might never acknowledge wrongdoing, or offer the apology and transformation that would make relationship repair possible. This observation aligned with what Jessica's uncle had already suggested, but hearing it from a professional with expertise in family dynamics made it feel more definitive and less like pessimistic speculation. She was going to need to grieve the loss of the mother she had wanted and believed she had, and accept the reality of the mother who actually existed. That grief process would be painful and would take time, but it was necessary for moving forward with clarity, rather than continued denial and wishful thinking. Dr. Brennan recommended a structured approach to any communication with Rachel. Rather than responding emotionally or engaging in extended text message exchanges that would inevitably become circular and unproductive, Jessica should consider composing a single clear message that established her boundaries and expectations. This message should be brief, factual, and focused on her own needs rather than attacking or accusing her mother. It should avoid extensive justification or defense of her position, as such explanations would simply provide material for argument and manipulation. The therapist helped Jessica begin drafting this communication during the session, working on language that was assertive without being aggressive, clear without being verbose, and firm without being cruel. The goal was to state what had changed and what Jessica needed going forward, while avoiding the trap of trying to make her mother understand or agree with her perspective. Her mother's understanding or agreement was not actually necessary for Jessica to establish and maintain boundaries. By the end of the therapy hour, Jessica had the outline of a response and a framework for thinking about her situation that provided more clarity than she had achieved through days of solitary processing. Dr. Brennan scheduled a follow-up appointment for the following week and encouraged Jessica to reach out sooner if the situation escalated in ways that felt overwhelming or unmanageable. She reminded Jessica that learning to set boundaries after years of being trained not to have any was difficult work that required support and practice. Leaving the therapy office, Jessica felt simultaneously exhausted from the emotional intensity of the session and energized by having a concrete plan of action. She would compose the message to her mother carefully over the next day, refining the language until it clearly communicated her position without providing opportunities for manipulation or derailment. She would send it when she felt ready, and then she would maintain firm boundaries regardless of how her mother responded. The evening was spent drafting and revising the message, working through multiple versions that each captured different aspects of what she needed to communicate. Some versions were too detailed, providing extensive explanations that would invite argument. Others were too brief, leaving too much ambiguity that could be exploited. She needed language that was precise enough to be clear but not so elaborate that it created vulnerabilities. By late that night, Jessica had a draft that felt close to ready. The message acknowledged that she had been made aware of how her mother spoke about her privately, stated that she would no longer be providing financial support, expressed that she needed time and space to process her feelings, and indicated that any future relationship would require fundamental changes in how they interacted. It did not accuse or attack, did not demand apology or explanation, simply stated new boundaries and expectations. She saved the draft without sending it, deciding to sleep on the language and review it with fresh perspective in the morning. The waiting felt appropriate, allowing her to be certain she was responding thoughtfully rather than reactively. This was too important to rush, even though the pressure to respond to her mother's increasingly frantic messages was becoming intense. Friday morning brought new urgency to the situation. Her mother had apparently decided that Jessica's continued silence indicated some kind of emergency, and had begun contacting other family members expressing concern about Jessica's welfare. Jessica's phone showed missed calls from 2 cousins and her grandmother, all presumably prompted by Rachel's narrative that Jessica had inexplicably stopped communicating and must be in some kind of trouble. The manipulation was escalating, moving beyond direct pressure to creating social pressure through extended family. Jessica recognized the tactic as consistent with her mother's pattern of using other people to reinforce her position and apply additional leverage when direct approaches were not producing desired results. It was simultaneously predictable and infuriating, evidence of exactly the kind of behavior that had motivated Jessica to establish boundaries in the first place. She sent brief messages to the concerned relatives assuring them she was fine and dealing with personal matters that she would explain when ready. These messages were deliberately vague, providing enough information to prevent panic without engaging in detailed explanations that would spread through the family network and potentially be distorted or weaponized. She needed to control her own narrative, rather than allowing her mother to establish the framework others would use to understand the situation. With that immediate crisis managed, Jessica returned to the draft message she had prepared the previous evening. Reading it with morning perspective, the language still felt appropriate and clear. She made minor adjustments to a few phrases, ensuring the tone was consistent throughout, and that no section could be easily misinterpreted or manipulated. When she was satisfied that the message represented exactly what she needed to communicate, she copied it into a new email to her mother. Her finger hovered over the send button, while she took several deep breaths and confirmed with herself that she was ready for whatever response this would trigger. This message would fundamentally alter her relationship with her mother, possibly ending it entirely. There would be no returning to the previous dynamic once these boundaries were stated. Whatever happened next would be new territory requiring navigation without the familiar patterns she had relied on throughout her life. Jessica pressed send and watched the message disappear from her draft folder into her sent items. The action felt both monumental and anticlimactic, a brief digital gesture that carried enormous emotional weight. The message would arrive in her mother's inbox within seconds, and the response would come soon after. The confrontation she had been both dreading and needing was now inevitable and imminent. She set her phone face down on her desk and tried to focus on work tasks that required her attention. But concentration was nearly impossible while waiting for the explosion she knew was coming. The response arrived within 18 minutes of Jessica sending her carefully constructed message, a speed that suggested her mother had been monitoring her email constantly while waiting for contact. The notification appeared on Jessica's phone screen during a client call, the preview text showing only the opening words, "How dare you?" before being cut off by character limits. Jessica felt her pulse spike immediately, the adrenaline response triggering despite her intellectual preparation for exactly this kind of reaction. She forced herself to complete the client conversation with full attention and professionalism, refusing to allow her personal crisis to compromise her work performance. The discussion involved complex estate planning considerations that required precise thinking and clear communication. She delivered both competently while a portion of her awareness remained fixed on the unread message waiting in her inbox, its presence exerting gravitational pull on her attention despite her determination to maintain focus. When the call concluded 30 minutes later, Jessica closed her office door and retrieved her phone with hands that trembled slightly. The physical response annoyed her, this involuntary manifestation of anxiety that her mother could still trigger even now when Jessica understood intellectually that she had done nothing wrong and had every right to establish boundaries. Years of conditioning could not be overridden instantly through conscious recognition alone. The body retained its trained responses even when the mind had achieved new understanding. She opened the email and began reading, her initial emotional reaction giving way quickly to analytical observation, as the message revealed exactly the patterns Dr. Brennan had predicted. Rachel's response was lengthy, running to multiple paragraphs that cycled through several distinct emotional strategies in rapid succession. The opening expressed shock and hurt that Jessica would make such serious accusations based on whatever misinformation she had apparently received. This quickly transitioned into anger at Jessica's ingratitude and refusal to acknowledge everything Rachel had sacrificed throughout Jessica's childhood. The middle section attempted guilt induction through detailed recounting of specific hardships Rachel had endured as a single mother, emphasizing the financial struggles and personal sacrifices that had enabled Jessica's comfortable upbringing and educational opportunities. Each anecdote was carefully selected to maximize emotional impact, reminding Jessica of times when Rachel had gone without things she needed, so that Jessica could have things she wanted. The message painted a picture of relentless maternal devotion that deserved appreciation, rather than the cruel rejection Jessica was now inflicting. The conclusion shifted tone again into something approaching pleading, expressing confusion about what had caused this sudden change in Jessica's behavior, and begging for an opportunity to discuss whatever misunderstanding had created such distance between them. Rachel emphasized their previously close relationship and expressed devastation at the thought of losing the connection they had always shared. She positioned herself as the confused and wounded party desperate to understand what had gone so terribly wrong. Notably absent from the entire message was any acknowledgement of the video content that had triggered Jessica's boundary setting. Rachel did not address being caught calling her daughter a cash machine or laughing about manipulating her for financial gain. She did not attempt to explain or contextualize those statements or offer any form of apology for them. Instead, she had constructed a narrative where Jessica was the aggressor acting on mysterious grievances, while Rachel was the innocent victim of inexplicable hostility. The omission was revealing in its deliberateness. Rachel clearly knew or suspected what information had reached Jessica, but rather than addressing it directly, she was attempting to reframe the entire situation around different emotional territory. If she could make the conversation about Jessica's supposed ingratitude and Rachel's past sacrifices, she could avoid ever having to account for her actual behavior and statements. It was a sophisticated deflection that might have been effective if Jessica had not spent the past week educating herself about exactly these kinds of manipulation tactics. Jessica read through the message 3 times, analyzing the rhetorical strategies and emotional appeals with the same systematic approach she brought to evaluating investment prospectuses. The structure was actually quite skillful, demonstrating her mother's intuitive understanding of which psychological buttons to push and in what sequence to maximize impact. Someone less prepared or less supported might easily have been derailed by this response, pulled into defensive justification or overcome by guilt at causing their mother such apparent distress. But Jessica had the benefit of professional guidance and clear documentation of actual events. She knew that the sacrifices being referenced were largely normal parental responsibilities that had been reframed as extraordinary burdens. She understood that the close relationship being mourned had been genuine only from her perspective while serving purely instrumental purposes from her mother's viewpoint. She recognized that the confusion and hurt being expressed were performances designed to restore the previous dynamic, rather than authentic emotional responses to relationship rupture. Dr. Brennan had specifically warned against engaging in extended back-and-forth communication that would inevitably become circular and unproductive. The therapeutic recommendation had been to send one clear boundary-setting message, and then maintain those boundaries regardless of what responses were deployed to challenge them. Jessica's job now was not to defend her position or prove her case or make her mother understand. Her job was simply to hold firm on the limits she had established. She composed a brief reply that acknowledged receiving Rachel's message, and reiterated that Jessica needed time and space as she had stated in her previous communication. She did not address any of the specific claims or emotional appeals in Rachel's lengthy response, did not provide the detailed justifications or defenses that her mother's message had been designed to elicit. She simply restated her boundary and ended the message cleanly without providing hooks for continued argument. This response was sent within 10 minutes of reading her mother's email, demonstrating that Jessica was not being swayed by the manipulation attempt and was not going to be drawn into the kind of extended emotional negotiation that would allow Rachel to gradually erode the boundaries being established. The speed and brevity of Jessica's reply communicated more clearly than any lengthy explanation could have that the dynamic had fundamentally shifted and would not be restored through familiar pressure tactics. The second response from Rachel arrived even faster than the first had, appearing less than 5 minutes after Jessica's brief acknowledgement. This message was shorter but significantly angrier in tone, abandoning the hurt confusion of the previous communication in favor of direct attack. Rachel accused Jessica of being selfish, ungrateful, and cruel. She characterized Jessica's boundary setting as abandonment and betrayal. She invoked obligations that daughters owed to mothers and suggested that Jessica's behavior was not only personally hurtful but morally wrong, according to values they supposedly shared. The message concluded with what was clearly intended as an ultimatum, though it was phrased as wounded questioning. Rachel asked whether Jessica really intended to throw away their entire relationship over whatever petty grievance had caused this disruption, and whether Jessica understood that some damage could not be repaired once certain lines were crossed. The implication was obvious. If Jessica did not immediately back down and restore the previous arrangement, their relationship would be permanently destroyed and the responsibility for that destruction would rest entirely on Jessica's shoulders. Jessica recognized this as the extinction burst that Dr. Brennan had described during their therapy session. When established patterns were disrupted, there was typically an intensification of the problematic behavior before it eventually decreased. Rachel was escalating her emotional manipulation because the usual approaches were not producing the desired results. The anger and threats represented increased pressure meant to force Jessica back into compliance through fear of relationship loss and guilt about causing that loss. Understanding the dynamic intellectually did not entirely eliminate its emotional impact. Jessica still felt the pull of old conditioning, the impulse to apologize and soothe and restore harmony at any cost to her own well-being. The threats about permanent relationship damage triggered genuine fear despite her recognition that the relationship being threatened was itself the source of harm she was trying to escape. Anxiety manifested physically as tightness in her chest and difficulty taking full breaths, stress responses that persisted even while her conscious mind remained committed to maintaining her boundaries. She did not reply to this second message. Dr. Brennan had been explicit that Jessica should not allow herself to be pulled into rapid-fire exchanges where her mother controlled the pace and emotional tenor of communication. Each response Jessica provided would be analyzed for weaknesses and used to craft increasingly targeted manipulation. The only way to prevent this escalation was to disengage completely from the cycle, to stop providing the reactions that fueled continued attempts at control. The discipline required to not respond felt enormous. Jessica drafted replies multiple times throughout the afternoon, typing out explanations and justifications and defenses that she then deleted without sending. The urge to make her mother understand, to prove that her position was reasonable and her boundaries were justified, remained powerful despite knowing that such efforts would be counterproductive. Her mother did not need to understand or agree. Her mother's understanding or agreement was completely irrelevant to Jessica's right to establish limits on how she would be treated. By late afternoon, additional messages had arrived from other family members who had clearly been recruited into Rachel's campaign to pressure Jessica into backing down. Her grandmother sent a text expressing disappointment that Jessica would treat her mother so coldly, and reminding her that family was more important than whatever disagreement had occurred. A cousin called and left a voicemail suggesting that Jessica was overreacting to something minor, and should consider how much her silence was hurting Rachel. An aunt sent an email with the subject line "Family comes first," that contained a lengthy lecture about forgiveness and the importance of honoring one's parents. The coordination was obvious and entirely predictable. Rachel had activated her social network to apply pressure from multiple directions simultaneously, creating a situation where Jessica would feel isolated and ganged up on by people presenting unified messaging about her supposed wrongdoing. It was a classic manipulation tactic that depended on the target being unwilling to defend themselves publicly or explain the actual situation to extended family, who had only heard one carefully crafted version of events. Jessica felt her resolve wavering under the combined weight of multiple people she cared about all telling her she was in the wrong. The rational knowledge that these relatives were working from incomplete and distorted information did not fully protect against the emotional impact of being characterized as the villain in a family drama. Self-doubt crept in despite her certainty about the legitimacy of her position. Perhaps she was overreacting. Perhaps the video had been taken out of context. Perhaps her interpretation of events was skewed by her own sensitivities, rather than reflecting objective reality. She called her Uncle Robert, needing to hear from someone who knew the full situation and could provide grounding in actual facts, rather than Rachel's strategic narrative. He answered immediately and listened as Jessica described the escalating communications and the recruitment of extended family into the pressure campaign. His response was both validating and pragmatic, confirming that this pattern was exactly what he had observed his sister deploy in other situations when she encountered resistance to her desires. Robert shared that he had received similar contact from Rachel, a tearful phone call where she had portrayed herself as a devastated mother whose ungrateful daughter had inexplicably cut off contact without explanation. She had asked him to intervene, to talk sense into Jessica and help repair whatever mysterious damage had occurred in their previously wonderful relationship. He had declined to participate in that effort, instead telling Rachel directly that he believed Jessica had legitimate reasons for establishing boundaries, and that Rachel should reflect on her own behavior rather than pressuring others to fix the situation for her. His refusal to cooperate with Rachel's campaign had resulted in him being cut off from further communication, at least temporarily, as she redirected her energy toward family members who were more susceptible to her framing of events. This information provided useful perspective about how his sister operated when challenged. Anyone who did not support her position became an adversary to be excluded or punished. There was no middle ground where people could maintain relationships with both parties while acknowledging complexity in the situation. It was complete loyalty to Rachel's version of reality or exclusion from her circle. Jessica asked whether she should explain the actual situation to the relatives who were pressuring her, whether she should share the video or the financial documentation or any of the evidence that supported her position. Robert considered this carefully before responding that such efforts were unlikely to be productive and might actually make things worse. Most of the family members involved had long-standing relationships with Rachel and would be heavily invested in maintaining their existing understanding of her character. Presenting them with evidence that contradicted their established perceptions would create cognitive dissonance that many would resolve by attacking the credibility of the evidence, rather than updating their view of Rachel. Additionally, sharing the video or financial details widely would likely be perceived as Jessica attacking her mother publicly rather than as Jessica defending herself against unfair characterization. The person who was being harmed but chose to expose that harm openly was often judged more harshly than the person who had caused the harm in the first place. It was an unfortunate dynamic, but a real one that needed to be considered when deciding how much information to share and with whom. His recommendation was that Jessica prepare a brief factual statement she could share with anyone who contacted her, something that acknowledged there were legitimate issues between herself and her mother without providing extensive detail or attacking Rachel's character. The statement should emphasize that this was a private matter between them, that Jessica was handling it thoughtfully with professional support, and that she appreciated concern but was not asking anyone to take sides or get involved. This approach would allow her to respond to inquiries without either leaving herself vulnerable to continued pressure or escalating the conflict into public family warfare. They spent 20 minutes working on language for such a statement, crafting something that struck the right balance between being informative and being bounded. The final version acknowledged that Jessica and her mother were working through some difficult issues, stated that Jessica had established some temporary boundaries while she processed her feelings, expressed appreciation for people's concern while requesting privacy, and emphasized that Jessica hoped to eventually resolve things but needed time and space to do so on a healthy timeline. This statement was intentionally ambiguous about who was at fault or what the specific issues were, avoiding the trap of trying to assign blame or prove Jessica's case to an audience that was not positioned to judge fairly. It presented the situation as complex relationship difficulty rather than clear-cut wrongdoing by either party, which was both more diplomatic and more likely to be accepted by relatives who were not prepared to believe seriously negative things about Rachel. After ending the call with her uncle, Jessica composed the agreed-upon statement and saved it in her phone's notes application, so she would have it readily available whenever someone contacted her. She then sent a version of it to her grandmother, her cousin, and her aunt, the three relatives who had already reached out expressing concern or criticism. The responses to this statement were mixed, ranging from her grandmother's curt reply that she hoped Jessica would come to her senses soon, to her cousin's more understanding acknowledgement that family issues could be complicated, and she trusted Jessica to handle things appropriately. The weekend arrived with Jessica feeling emotionally battered from the week's intensity, but also increasingly certain that she had made the right decision in establishing boundaries. The alternative of returning to the previous dynamic was unthinkable now that she had seen clearly how that dynamic functioned and what it cost her. Even if maintaining boundaries proved difficult and created ongoing family conflict, it was preferable to resuming the role of cash machine for someone who viewed her utility as more valuable than her humanity. Saturday morning brought a new tactic from Rachel, who apparently recognized that direct pressure and emotional manipulation were not producing the desired restoration of previous patterns. An email arrived with an entirely different tone than the previous angry messages, this one adopting a position of conciliation and openness to dialogue. Rachel wrote that she had been reflecting on Jessica's concerns and recognized that perhaps their relationship had developed some unhealthy patterns that needed to be addressed. She suggested they meet for lunch to discuss things calmly and work toward mutual understanding. The message was sophisticated in its apparent reasonableness, presenting Rachel as someone who was willing to acknowledge problems and engage in genuine conversation about resolution. It positioned the meeting as a mutual effort toward relationship repair rather than as an opportunity for Rachel to pressure Jessica into backing down. Someone less educated about manipulation tactics might read this as evidence of progress and openness to change. But Jessica recognized several red flags in the communication. The acknowledgement of unhealthy patterns was notably vague, not specifying what those patterns might be, or taking any concrete responsibility for creating them. The framing around mutual understanding suggested that both parties bore equal responsibility for whatever issues existed, when in reality the exploitation had been entirely one-directional. The proposed lunch meeting would occur on Rachel's preferred timeline and likely at a location she chose, putting Jessica at a disadvantage in terms of both emotional preparation and environmental control. Most significantly, there was still no direct acknowledgement of the video content or the financial exploitation it revealed. Rachel was attempting to move forward into reconciliation without ever addressing the specific behavior that had precipitated the boundary setting. This approach would allow her to appear cooperative and willing to work on the relationship, while never actually being accountable for the harm she had caused. If Jessica accepted this framework, they would end up having generic conversations about communication styles and mutual needs, rather than addressing the fundamental issue of Rachel viewing and treating Jessica as a resource rather than a person. Jessica composed a response declining the lunch invitation and reiterating her need for continued time and space. She acknowledged receiving Rachel's message and noted that any future conversations would need to include direct discussion of specific behaviors and patterns, rather than vague generalities about relationship improvement. She stated clearly that she would consider meeting only after Rachel demonstrated genuine accountability for calling Jessica a cash machine, and for the years of financial exploitation that had characterized their relationship. This response was more specific than her previous brief boundary statements, directly naming the issues that needed to be addressed, rather than allowing them to remain hidden beneath euphemistic language about relationship difficulties. Dr. Brennan had recommended this approach during their therapy session, explaining that manipulative people often tried to keep conversations at a high level of abstraction where they could avoid accountability for concrete actions. Forcing specificity into the dialogue made it much harder for them to maintain plausible deniability or redirect attention away from their actual behavior. Rachel's reply to this message abandoned all pretense of conciliation and returned to direct attack with intensified hostility. She denied ever calling Jessica a cash machine and characterized any such claim as a ridiculous fabrication. She accused Jessica of making up stories to justify her cruel treatment of her mother. She declared that if Jessica was going to spread lies and refuse reasonable attempts at reconciliation, then perhaps they should indeed cease contact entirely, since Rachel refused to be subjected to such disrespectful treatment from her own daughter. The denial was particularly interesting given that Rachel had never asked where Jessica had gotten her information about the cash machine comment. She had simply moved directly to denying it ever happened, which suggested she knew exactly what Jessica was referring to even while claiming it was fabricated. The defensiveness and aggression indicated that Jessica's insistence on naming specific behavior had hit its target and created discomfort that Rachel was trying to deflect through counterattack. Jessica did not respond to this message or to the several that followed over the remainder of the weekend, each cycling through different emotional appeals and manipulation strategies, as Rachel attempted to find an approach that would work. The messages ranged from angry accusations to tearful pleading to cold dismissiveness to renewed attempts at conciliation, demonstrating the full range of tactics Rachel had available when previous methods failed to achieve desired results. By Sunday evening, the communication from Rachel had ceased temporarily, though messages continued to arrive periodically from other family members who were still being fed distorted versions of the situation and enlisted to apply pressure. Jessica maintained her standard brief response to these contacts, neither defending herself extensively nor attacking her mother, simply requesting privacy and time to work through personal matters. The weekend had been exhausting despite minimal external obligations, the emotional labor of maintaining boundaries under sustained pressure taking significant toll. Jessica felt depleted in ways that physical rest did not address, drained by the constant need to resist conditioning that pulled her toward compliance and peacekeeping at any cost. She recognized that this exhaustion was part of the process, that establishing new patterns after years of dysfunctional ones would necessarily involve difficulty and discomfort before it eventually became more natural. Sunday evening she spent journaling about the week's events, processing her observations and emotional responses through writing that helped clarify her thinking and track her progress. The exercise revealed several important insights about her own patterns and vulnerabilities that would be useful for continued boundary maintenance. She noticed her tendency to want to explain and justify herself excessively, to prove the legitimacy of her position rather than simply asserting her right to establish limits regardless of whether others agreed with them. She observed her difficulty tolerating other people's disappointment or anger, even when that disappointment or anger was being weaponized to manipulate her. These observations would be valuable to bring to her next therapy session, offering material for deeper work on the psychological patterns that had made her vulnerable to exploitation in the first place. Understanding why she had been such an effective target for her mother's manipulation would help her develop stronger defenses against similar dynamics in other relationships and contexts. Monday morning arrived with Jessica feeling more prepared to handle whatever the new week would bring. She had successfully navigated the initial crisis period and maintained her boundaries despite significant pressure to abandon them. Her mother's tactics had followed predictable patterns that actually validated Jessica's understanding of the relationship dynamics, rather than causing her to doubt her perceptions. The support structure she had built through her uncle and her therapist was proving adequate to sustain her through the difficulty of transformation. The week ahead would bring her second therapy session, and presumably continued attempts from her mother to restore the previous relationship structure. But Jessica was learning to tolerate the discomfort of other people's reactions without allowing those reactions to override her own judgment about what boundaries she needed. The conditioning that had made her an effective cash machine was being gradually overwritten by new understanding and new patterns that prioritized her own well-being alongside her care for others. She recognized that this process would be ongoing rather than quickly resolved, that relationship patterns built over decades would not be dismantled in a single week of confrontation and boundary setting. But the foundation was being established, the initial rupture had been survived, and she was discovering resources within herself that had been suppressed by years of prioritizing her mother's needs over her own legitimate self-protection. The road ahead remained uncertain and likely difficult, but she was walking it with increasing confidence that she deserved better treatment than she had been receiving, and that she was capable of insisting on that better treatment, regardless of the costs involved. The second week following Jessica's boundary establishment brought unexpected developments in her professional environment that illuminated how thoroughly her personal dynamics had been affecting her work life in ways she had not previously recognized. Monday morning began with a routine quarterly review meeting, where senior partners evaluated the performance and trajectory of advisors being considered for advancement within the firm. Jessica had been working toward senior partner status for 18 months, consistently exceeding her targets and building a strong client portfolio that demonstrated both technical expertise and relationship management skills. She entered the conference room expecting the standard performance review discussion, prepared with her metrics documentation and strategic planning materials. The three existing senior partners sat around the polished mahogany table with Patricia Morrison positioned at the head, her expression revealing nothing about the tone the meeting would take. Jessica settled into her chair and arranged her materials while engaging in the brief preliminary small talk that preceded substantive business discussion. Patricia opened the formal portion of the meeting by acknowledging Jessica's consistent strong performance across all measurable dimensions of the advisor role. Client satisfaction scores exceeded firm averages significantly. Portfolio returns outperformed relevant benchmarks. New client acquisition had been robust. Retention rates approached perfection with only one client departure in the past year attributable to relocation rather than service dissatisfaction. By every quantitative measure, Jessica had demonstrated the competence and reliability expected of someone advancing to senior partnership. However, Patricia continued, there were qualitative concerns that needed to be addressed before the partnership decision could be finalized. Over the past several months, some of the senior team had observed what appeared to be overextension in Jessica's client commitments and responsiveness patterns. She was consistently available outside normal business hours, responding to client emails late into evenings, and on weekends with a speed that suggested she was perpetually monitoring communications. She had difficulty delegating tasks to junior team members even when appropriate, seeming to believe that only her personal attention was adequate for client needs. Most concerning was a pattern the partners had noticed where Jessica would sometimes absorb costs or make concessions to clients that were not strategically necessary, acting as though maintaining absolute client satisfaction required her to give more than situations actually demanded. While client service excellence was certainly valued, there was a difference between strategic relationship investment and a compulsive need to ensure everyone was happy at personal expense. The latter suggested boundary issues that could become problematic at the partnership level, where strategic judgment needed to override people-pleasing impulses. Patricia's observations landed with unexpected force. Jessica had thought she was demonstrating dedication and commitment through her availability and responsiveness. She had believed her willingness to go above and beyond for clients reflected professional excellence, rather than personal dysfunction. Hearing these patterns described as concerning rather than commendable created immediate cognitive dissonance that competed with her intellectual understanding that the feedback was probably accurate and important. The other senior partners contributed their own observations, each adding detail to the picture being painted of an advisor who struggled with appropriate professional boundaries in ways that mirrored her personal relationship patterns. One partner noted that Jessica had difficulty saying no to client requests, even when those requests were outside the scope of their advisory relationship or would require disproportionate time investment relative to the account size. Another mentioned that Jessica seemed to take client disappointments or concerns exceptionally personally, as though their satisfaction was a reflection of her fundamental worth, rather than a complex outcome influenced by many factors beyond her control. The feedback session was conducted with care and framed as developmental rather than punitive. The partners emphasized that they were raising these issues precisely because they valued Jessica's contributions and wanted her to succeed at the partnership level. But partnership required different capabilities than individual advisor work demanded. Partners needed to make strategic decisions about resource allocation, needed to maintain appropriate boundaries with clients and staff, needed to delegate effectively rather than trying to personally manage every detail. The patterns they were observing suggested Jessica would struggle with these requirements unless she addressed the underlying issues driving her overextension. Patricia concluded the feedback portion of the meeting by connecting these professional observations to the personal situation she knew Jessica was navigating. She noted that people's relationship patterns tended to be consistent across contexts, that someone who struggled with boundaries in family relationships would likely demonstrate similar struggles in professional settings. The work Jessica was doing with her therapist to understand and change her personal dynamics would almost certainly benefit her professional development as well. The partnership decision would be revisited in 6 months, providing time for Jessica to demonstrate growth in these areas, while continuing her strong technical performance. Jessica left the meeting feeling shaken in ways that went beyond simple professional disappointment. She had genuinely not recognized how her personal conditioning was manifesting in her work behavior, had not seen the connection between her inability to set limits with her mother and her difficulty establishing appropriate boundaries with clients. The revelation was uncomfortable but also strangely validating, confirming that the patterns she was working to change were pervasive enough to affect multiple domains of her life, and therefore worth the difficulty of transformation. She spent the remainder of Monday processing this feedback and beginning to identify specific instances where her professional behavior had reflected the same people-pleasing and boundary-violating patterns that characterized her personal relationships. The late-night email responses that sacrificed her rest to provide immediate reassurance to clients. The reluctance to delegate even routine tasks, because she believed only her personal attention was adequate. The tendency to absorb small costs, rather than having potentially uncomfortable conversations about billing or scope. Each example demonstrated the same core belief that her worth was contingent on her usefulness, and that maintaining relationships required her to give more than was reasonable or sustainable. Her therapy appointment Thursday afternoon provided opportunity to discuss both the professional feedback and the continued evolution of her situation with her mother. Dr. Brennan listened to Jessica's account of the partnership meeting with particular attention, recognizing immediately the significance of these observations for the broader therapeutic work they were undertaking. The therapist noted that Jessica's awareness of how pervasively her conditioning affected her life was actually a positive development, even though discovering the extent of the problem felt overwhelming. Dr. Brennan explained that people raised in exploitative family systems typically developed adaptive strategies that helped them survive those difficult environments, but became maladaptive when applied to healthier contexts. Jessica had learned that her value came from her utility, that love was conditional on meeting others' needs, and that maintaining connection required constant vigilance about others' satisfaction with her performance. These beliefs had helped her navigate a relationship with a mother who genuinely did value utility over inherent worth. But they were causing problems in professional and personal contexts where healthier dynamics were possible, and where reciprocity was actually expected, rather than being seen as weakness or failure. The therapeutic work going forward would involve not just establishing boundaries with her mother, but fundamentally reconstructing Jessica's understanding of her own worth and the appropriate structure of relationships. This was deeper and more extensive work than simply learning to say no to financial requests. It required examining and changing core beliefs about her identity and value that had been established during her formative years and reinforced through decades of interaction patterns. Jessica shared the latest developments in her mother's campaign to restore the previous relationship dynamic. Rachel had apparently recognized that direct pressure was counterproductive and had shifted to a strategy of periodic communication that mixed brief expressions of missing Jessica with pointed observations about Jessica's supposed character flaws. These messages arrived every few days, carefully calibrated to maintain pressure without triggering the kind of aggressive response that had clearly failed in earlier attempts. The content of these messages was instructive in its consistency. Rachel would express sadness about the distance between them, mention some memory from Jessica's childhood that was meant to evoke nostalgia and guilt, and then include a comment about how the current situation revealed disappointing aspects of Jessica's character that Rachel had hoped would not manifest. The messages were never long enough to feel like harassment, but appeared frequently enough to ensure Jessica could not forget about the unresolved tension in their relationship. Dr. Brennan identified this as a more sophisticated manipulation approach than the earlier emotional flooding. Rachel was attempting to establish a new baseline of minimal contact that kept her present in Jessica's awareness, while avoiding the kind of overt pressure that had strengthened Jessica's resolve to maintain distance. The goal was to create a sense of ongoing guilt and obligation that would gradually erode Jessica's boundaries through accumulated weight, rather than through dramatic confrontation. The appropriate response, according to the therapist, was to continue the pattern Jessica had already established of not engaging with these communications. Each response Jessica provided, even brief ones, reinforced that this communication strategy was effective in maintaining her attention and emotional investment. Complete non-engagement would eventually communicate that the tactic was not producing desired results and might prompt Rachel to either escalate to something more overt that would be easier for Jessica to recognize and resist, or to eventually decrease the frequency of contact when it became clear that minimal engagement was not achieving anything. Jessica asked about the ethics of completely ignoring someone who was ostensibly reaching out in pain about a damaged relationship. Even understanding intellectually that her mother's expressions of hurt were performative rather than genuine, Jessica still struggled with the feeling that refusing to respond was cruel, and made her the kind of cold person her mother's messages implied she was becoming. This internal conflict illustrated exactly the conditioning that needed to be addressed, the deep belief that being a good person required her to prioritize others' expressed feelings over her own legitimate need for protection. Dr. Brennan addressed this concern directly and firmly. Jessica's responsibility was to maintain boundaries that protected her well-being, not to manage her mother's emotions or ensure her mother never experienced discomfort. Rachel was an adult with her own resources and support systems. If she was genuinely distressed about the relationship rupture, she had access to therapy and other forms of support that did not require Jessica to sacrifice her own healing process. More importantly, Rachel's distress, to the extent it was authentic rather than performed, was a natural consequence of her own behavior patterns finally producing costs she had previously avoided. The therapist emphasized that people did not change behavior that was working successfully for them. As long as Rachel's exploitation and manipulation produced the results she desired without significant negative consequences, she had no motivation to examine or modify those patterns. Jessica maintaining boundaries and allowing Rachel to experience the natural results of her choices was not cruelty. It was the only mechanism that might eventually create conditions where Rachel would be motivated to engage in genuine self-reflection and behavior change. This framing helped Jessica understand that her boundary maintenance was not just self-protection, but potentially the most loving thing she could do for her mother in the long term. Continuing to enable the exploitation would have been the truly unkind choice, allowing Rachel to persist in patterns that damaged both of them and prevented authentic connection from ever developing. The discomfort Rachel was experiencing now might ultimately serve her better than Jessica's continued compliance ever could have. The therapy session moved into discussion about Jessica's professional development needs, and how the work they were doing on personal boundaries would necessarily support her career advancement. Dr. Brennan suggested that Jessica might benefit from working with an executive coach in addition to continuing therapy, someone who could help her apply the insights from therapeutic work specifically to her professional context, and develop new leadership patterns that balance client service with appropriate self-protection. Jessica was initially resistant to adding another professional support relationship, concerned about the time commitment and the additional expense. But the therapist noted that this resistance itself reflected patterns worth examining. Jessica had spent years investing enormous financial resources in her mother without question or concern about sustainability. She had sent over $160,000 to someone who mocked her for it. But she hesitated to invest a fraction of that amount in professional development that would support her career advancement and long-term earning capacity. The disparity revealed how completely she had been conditioned to prioritize others' needs while treating her own development as optional or self-indulgent. This observation struck Jessica forcefully, illustrating in concrete terms how her conditioning affected her resource allocation decisions across all domains. She had believed she was being financially responsible and strategic in her career planning, but actually she had been systematically underinvesting in herself while overinvesting in someone who provided no return except criticism and continued demands. Recognizing this pattern created immediate clarity about the executive coaching decision. Of course, she should invest in support that would help her achieve partnership and increase her long-term earning potential. The only question was why she had needed the therapist to point out something so obvious. By the end of the session, Jessica had agreed to research executive coaches who specialized in boundary development and leadership transition support. Dr. Brennan provided a referral to someone she knew who worked extensively with high-performing professionals struggling with overextension and people-pleasing patterns. The next therapy appointment was scheduled for 2 weeks out, rather than the following week, reflecting the therapist's assessment that Jessica was stabilizing in her boundary maintenance and could benefit from slightly more space between sessions to practice independence. The following week brought an unexpected development that tested Jessica's growing capacity for boundary maintenance in a new context. Her mother's birthday occurred on Tuesday, a date that had historically been marked by Jessica organizing celebrations and providing substantial gifts that demonstrated both thoughtfulness and financial generosity. The previous year she had arranged a surprise dinner party with Rachel's closest friends and had given her an expensive piece of jewelry she had mentioned wanting. The year before that had involved a weekend spa retreat that Jessica had fully funded. As the date approached, Jessica received multiple messages from family members asking what she was planning for her mother's birthday and expressing certainty that whatever difficulties existed between them would surely be set aside for such an important occasion. The messages carried the implicit assumption that family obligations superseded personal boundaries, that certain events were significant enough to require temporary suspension of whatever conflicts might be occurring. The pressure was subtle but unmistakable, communicating that Jessica would be judged harshly if she failed to acknowledge her mother's birthday, appropriately regardless of the current state of their relationship. Jessica spent considerable time considering how to handle this situation. Ignoring the birthday entirely felt potentially excessive, a statement that might communicate more hostility than she actually felt. But organizing a celebration or providing an expensive gift would send the wrong message about her boundaries, and would likely be interpreted as evidence that she was softening her position. She needed an approach that acknowledged the date without compromising the limits she had established or creating false hope that their relationship was returning to its previous pattern. After consultation with her Uncle Robert, who had experienced navigating similar situations with Rachel over the years, Jessica decided to send a simple card with a brief handwritten note, wishing her mother a happy birthday and expressing hope that she enjoyed her day. The gesture was polite and appropriate without being effusive or accompanied by the kind of gift that would suggest nothing had changed between them. It threaded the needle between complete silence and the elaborate celebration that had historically been expected. The card was mailed several days before the birthday to ensure timely arrival, and Jessica braced herself for whatever response it would generate. What she had not anticipated was that her mother would interpret the modest acknowledgement as an opening for renewed contact and pressure. Within hours of presumably receiving the card on her birthday, Rachel sent a lengthy text message thanking Jessica for remembering and using the gesture as evidence that Jessica still cared and wanted to repair their relationship. The message suggested they meet for lunch the following week to discuss moving forward, framing Jessica's simple birthday card as though it had been a significant conciliatory gesture rather than basic courtesy. The response illustrated perfectly what Dr. Brennan had warned about regarding giving any amount of engagement to someone actively trying to erode boundaries. Rachel had taken the minimal gesture and amplified it into something far more significant than intended, using it to justify renewed pressure for contact and reconciliation on her terms. Jessica recognized immediately that she had made a strategic error, that the polite acknowledgement had created more problems than complete silence would have. She did not respond to Rachel's text message, allowing it to sit unanswered despite the pull to clarify that the birthday card had not represented any change in her position about maintaining distance and boundaries. But explaining would only create more opportunity for manipulation and misinterpretation. The clearer communication was simply to return to complete non-engagement, and let Rachel draw her own conclusions from the continued silence following the single birthday acknowledgement. This experience provided valuable learning about the challenges of maintaining boundaries with people who were actively seeking any opening to restore previous dynamics. Jessica understood now why Dr. Brennan and her uncle had both suggested that complete disengagement was often clearer and ultimately kinder than partial contact that created confusion about what was and was not changing. Trying to maintain some minimal connection while establishing major boundaries created ambiguity that could be exploited, whereas complete separation provided unmistakable clarity that left less room for willful misinterpretation. The professional sphere continued to provide opportunities for Jessica to practice applying boundary insights to her work relationships. She began implementing small changes in how she managed client communications, establishing clearer parameters around her availability and response times. She started including junior team members in client interactions where previously she would have handled everything personally, discovering that her colleagues were quite capable when given appropriate opportunity and guidance. She practiced saying no to client requests that fell outside reasonable scope, finding that clients typically accepted such limits without the dramatic negative consequences she had feared. Each small successful boundary establishment built her confidence and demonstrated that her catastrophic predictions about relationship consequences rarely materialized when she set appropriate limits. Clients did not leave the firm when she stopped responding to emails at midnight. Junior colleagues did not fail spectacularly when entrusted with responsibilities. The world did not end when she prioritized her own rest and sustainability over constant availability. These experiences provided evidence that challenged the core beliefs driving her boundary difficulties, creating lived experience that competed with the conditioning from her family of origin. By the end of her second week of focused boundary practice, Jessica noticed changes in how she felt physically and emotionally. The constant low-level anxiety that had characterized much of her adult life had decreased noticeably. She was sleeping better, no longer lying awake worrying about whether she had adequately met everyone's needs, or whether someone was dissatisfied with her performance. Her energy levels were higher, freed from the constant drain of monitoring and managing others' emotional states and expectations. She felt more present in her own life rather than constantly performing for an imagined audience whose approval determined her worth. These improvements were motivating in themselves, providing tangible benefits that reinforced her commitment to continuing the difficult work of establishing and maintaining boundaries. The process remained uncomfortable, and her conditioning still created powerful pulls toward old patterns. But she was developing competing evidence that different approaches were possible and actually produced better outcomes for her well-being and effectiveness. The transformation was beginning to feel sustainable, rather than like a temporary deviation from her natural patterns that would inevitably collapse under pressure. Her next major challenge arrived when her grandmother, who had been among the family members pressuring her to reconcile with Rachel, had a health scare that required brief hospitalization. The situation created immediate complexity about how Jessica would navigate family interaction during a crisis, while maintaining the boundaries she had established with her mother. Her grandmother was someone she genuinely cared about independent of the loyalty pressure, and she wanted to provide support during a frightening time. But doing so would necessarily involve contact with Rachel, who would certainly be present at the hospital, and would likely use the crisis to pressure for reconciliation. Jessica consulted with both her therapist and her uncle about how to handle this situation. The consensus guidance was that she should visit her grandmother if that felt right to her, but that she should go prepared with clear internal boundaries about what interactions with her mother would and would not include. She could be polite and civil without engaging in substantive conversation about their relationship. She could acknowledge her mother's presence without treating it as an opportunity for the heart-to-heart discussion Rachel was undoubtedly hoping the crisis would facilitate. The hospital visit occurred on a Saturday afternoon when Jessica's grandmother was already recovering well, and expected to be discharged within a day. Jessica arrived with flowers and spent an hour sitting with her grandmother, talking about neutral topics and providing the companionship that hospital stays made particularly valuable. Rachel was indeed present, positioned in the chair closest to the bed and clearly established as the primary family member managing her mother's care. The interaction between Jessica and Rachel was brief and surface-level polite. Jessica greeted her mother with basic courtesy, and Rachel responded in kind, neither of them addressing the elephant in the room or using the situation to force conversations that Jessica had made clear she was not willing to have. The civility was undoubtedly strategic on Rachel's part, an attempt to demonstrate reasonableness and perhaps to use witnesses to put Jessica in a position where maintaining distance would appear cruel or excessive. But Jessica had prepared for exactly this scenario, and was able to maintain her composure and boundaries despite the emotional complexity of the situation. She focused her attention on her grandmother, provided appropriate support, and extracted herself after a reasonable visit duration without being drawn into the extended family processing that was occurring in the waiting areas. She had demonstrated that she could navigate necessary family contact without compromising her established limits, a significant confidence-building experience that proved she was capable of managing complexity, rather than only being able to maintain boundaries through complete avoidance. The weeks following this incident brought gradual normalization of Jessica's new patterns. Her mother's attempts at contact became less frequent as it became increasingly clear that the tactics being deployed were not producing results. Extended family members stopped pressuring her as actively, either because they had accepted that she was committed to her position, or because Rachel had stopped mobilizing them as aggressively once it became apparent they could not sway Jessica's decisions. The crisis energy that had characterized the first weeks following her boundary establishment began to settle into a new equilibrium that was uncomfortable but stable. Jessica continued her therapy work, deepening her understanding of the patterns that had made her vulnerable to exploitation, and developing new frameworks for understanding relationships and her place within them. She engaged an executive coach who helped her apply boundary insights to her professional development, creating concrete strategies for delegation, client management, and the kind of strategic thinking required at the partnership level. She maintained complete financial separation from her mother, experiencing for the first time in years what it felt like to allocate her resources according to her own priorities rather than in response to others' demands. The transformation was neither quick nor linear. There were setbacks and moments of doubt, times when the pull of old patterns felt overwhelming, and the loneliness of her new position felt unbearable. But there were also moments of unexpected joy and freedom, experiences of making choices based purely on her own preferences, rather than on others' expectations or needs. She was discovering who she was independent of her role as helper and provider, finding interests and desires that had been suppressed by the constant attention to others' agendas. She was building a life that was genuinely hers rather than a performance designed to earn love through usefulness. 3 months into her journey of boundary establishment and personal reconstruction, Jessica experienced a breakthrough that arrived not through dramatic confrontation, but through quiet accumulation of small changes that collectively transformed her internal landscape. The breakthrough manifested during an unremarkable Tuesday evening, when she realized she had gone an entire day without thinking about her mother, or monitoring her phone for messages that might require emotional management. The absence of that constant background vigilance created space for presence in her own life that had been unavailable, when so much of her mental energy was consumed by relationship maintenance and guilt management. This shift in her internal experience coincided with tangible external changes that validated her decision to maintain boundaries despite the significant costs involved. Her savings account balance had increased substantially over the 3 months without the regular transfers and sporadic large payments to her mother. The money that had previously flowed out immediately upon being earned was now accumulating in ways that allowed Jessica to contemplate financial goals she had never previously considered achievable. She began researching investment properties, recognizing that she could potentially purchase real estate within the next year if she maintained her current earning trajectory and spending discipline. The irony was not lost on her that the financial security she had believed she was building for her mother's benefit was now available for her own future precisely because she had stopped subsidizing someone who viewed that support as entitlement rather than gift. The $160,000 she had transferred over 5 years represented a substantial down payment on her own life. resources that could have established foundations for her future, but had instead disappeared into her mother's lifestyle without creating any lasting value or genuine appreciation. The opportunity cost of those years of financial extraction was staggering when she allowed herself to calculate it honestly. Her professional development showed parallel progress that demonstrated how thoroughly the personal and professional dimensions of her life had been intertwined. The executive coach she had engaged was helping her identify and modify the workplace patterns that had concerned the senior partners during her partnership review. She was learning to delegate effectively, discovering that releasing control over every detail actually produced better outcomes than her previous approach of trying to personally manage all aspects of client relationships. Her junior colleagues were developing more rapidly when given appropriate responsibility and autonomy, and clients were receiving more comprehensive service from a team approach than they had from her individual overextension. The boundary work she was doing extended beyond just saying no to unreasonable requests. It involved fundamental reconceptualization of what excellent professional service actually required and recognition that sustainable high performance depended on appropriate limits, rather than on endless availability. Jessica was discovering that she could maintain her strong client relationships and high-performance standards, while also preserving energy and capacity for her own development and well-being. The two goals were not actually in conflict as she had been conditioned to believe. They were mutually reinforcing when approached with appropriate structure and boundaries. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.